Heroes and Hardships is a universal RPG rule system written by Jason Duff and published in 2023 after a successful Kickstarter. It was highly anticipated at the time since it was intended to be a crunchier yet innovative attempt on the universal RPG rule set. Things like having no hit points and using a D10 dice pool system definitely seemed pretty intriguing at the time. I'm always wary of RPGs that purport to be able to handle fantasy, sci-fi, modern, superhero, and historical games. The general consensus for Heroes and Hardships is that it's a little more complete than Savage Worlds, which I have overviewed on this channel, but not as convoluted as GURPS, which I haven't covered in any way. There's old, familiar, and relatively involved. Then there's more modern and very uncomplex, and everything in between. But the beauty of being in the middle of a golden age of RPGs is that you get to decide what's good out of a glut of choices. But the best way to see if Heroes and Hardships is for you is to just crack open the core rulebook and walk through all of the major components of the system as usual. First thing I want to show you is the physical book. It only runs about 255 pages, but it's hefty in the hand because of the quality paper stock used for the cover and pages. The cover has a matte finish with good color. The end papers are full color art. Here's probably the most important detail that you need to know. It was printed through Stand Art in Lithuania. This is the same printer that Free League uses for most, if not all, of their books, at least at the time of this recording, meaning this is a very high quality physical book. Heavy, durable, with stitched binding and good paper and good color. We're going to go through the digital version of this book, but if you do end up deciding that you want to give this game a try, I would highly recommend going with the physical plus digital version. I'll leave a link down below for that. It's also worth mentioning that at the time of recording, the Heroes and Hardships ecosystem has expanded to 5 categories of smaller supplements. That being said, I'm only going to be covering the core rulebook in this video. I think the most important aspect of this system to cover is how it uses dice. In a nutshell, anytime you have a skill check of any sort, you choose the skill that you're going to use and the attribute that it's governed by, then you add up those 2 ranks to determine the number of d10s you will be able to roll. Then add any additional dice to your pool from any benefits you might have had in that situation. Then you roll those dice, but you only keep the number of dice rolled as determined by that governing attribute. The remaining dice are added up and compared against another number, like a target number for the challenge or another character's opposing roll. There is one main way for your check to be penalized, and that's with a hardship, such as from a wound or situational feature. Each hardship confers 1 penalty die, which is an exploding d10 that is added to the difficulty of a roll. One of the most prominent features of this system is the power levels, and this is something a lot of people who run the system say they really appreciate. The game has 3 power levels where you can play either with some semblance of gritty realism, as high-powered heroes, or as demigod-like characters who deal in stakes of ultimate importance. This 3-tiered system is not just some one-off notion mentioned in the introduction of the book either. The options appear throughout the book in all aspects of the mechanics. For example, the target numbers here come in 3 sets, and depending on what level you want to run a game in, you would adopt one set or another. Since this game system is a bit more on the option-heavy and crunchy side of the spectrum, your character has 12 core attributes, and they fall under 3 categories: physical, mental, and social. There's also a 13th attribute called Fate, which is a point pool that you can use as a meta currency to affect rolls and other things. Fate is an optional attribute unless you want your character to use spells or superpowers, in which case it's required. Your character also has skills, which are ranked from 0 to 10 and each associated with a single attribute. The skill can never be ranked above the associated core attribute. And here's where you really see a lot of granularity, or the start of it in this rule system: the derived stats, or characteristics. There are a whopping 12 derived stats that you can calculate for your character after working out their core stats. They don't all come into play in every game genre though. Magic defense or insanity threshold, for example, may just not be applicable to your game, but most of these are pretty important. Your character also gets so-called abilities and ancestry traits. Abilities are costlier to obtain than skills, but naturally they are more potent. Advancement in this game is a matter of spending experience points to upgrade your core attributes, skill ranks, and abilities. What this means is that there are no levels, and by extension there are no classes. Your character can possess any number of combinations of skills and abilities, so the door is wide open in terms of what kind of character you end up with. There is a spot on your character sheet to describe their occupation or job or whatever, but that's purely descriptive. Your character's functional identity lies in their skills and abilities, which again can be in whatever combination you want. As far as the actual skills and abilities to choose from, they are organized by their governing core attribute, and there are a total of 55 skills and 119 abilities listed in the core rulebook. I had a very hard time trying to come up with a skill or ability that wasn't referenced in this massive list. It makes sense that the game would have this many to choose from, not only because skills and abilities are a critical component of your play options and play experience, but because it's a universal rules system that is trying to cover all the bases. Nevertheless, there is some guidance here on how you can come up with custom skills, and of course I think if you play this game enough, you'll eventually find the need to create a new skill or two. But the default 174 skills and abilities would probably keep your table pretty busy for a while. Ancestry traits are like abilities in that they are pretty potent, but they are limited to which ancestry you choose. To be honest, the core rulebook doesn't get very expansive with the number of ancestries on offer. Under the fantasy category, there are dwarves, halflings, humans, and elves. Science fiction has androids, greys, interlopers, which are like alien shapeshifters, and sentient insectoids, and that's it. But given the total list of ancestry traits here, it wouldn't be hard to cobble together new trait lists for custom ancestries if you need them. And as far as the traits themselves, they are each given a good amount of detail, including options for all 3 power levels of play. This is where I really started to realize that the 3 power levels on offer with this system are really 3 different tracks of math calculations. We'll see more of that in a minute. There are 43 ancestry traits in total, and of course you can make up your own, but it could be a little tricky to get the right balance on power levels if you're homebrewing these. It's also worth noting that some of these traits get very involved in the descriptions compared to the skills and abilities, which are all mercifully concise. But this just means that your character's ancestry traits are potentially some of the most central and important things that they're able to do in the fiction. All PCs also have at least one flaw, which is a really nice feature I see in some RPGs, but not too many. This is just a way to inject some personal and ongoing conflict in a collective story, and to deepen a character right from the start. The first of these flaws are presented by the categories of physical, mental, and fate. And then there are 7 general flaws listed. There are a total of 74 flaws listed in this core rulebook. Okay, so combat is definitely one of the most distinctive features of this system. I'm not going to go through the special case rules or the minutia, but I do want to kind of cover the basic idea here. So instead of having rounds, each character in a combat encounter is ranked by action points used. If you really wanted to abstract this into time, you could almost think of 1 AP representing 1 second of time. Anytime a character wants to take an action during combat, they choose an action, which has an associated AP cost. When they spend the AP and do the action, the AP gets added to their name on a chart, and they move down in rank on a combat track. In this case, the lower the AP value, the higher the rank. The character with the lowest AP value on the list performs their next turn. The rules for combat here are written extremely clearly, and I didn't have any problem understanding any of it, but to break it down to you in this video would probably take 15 minutes, which is a little too much time. Probably the best way for you to see the level of complexity with melee combat is to maybe pause the video and read this table. Ranged combat is slightly different, but largely the same as melee. You can pause it here too if you like. And for further elucidation, you can pause the video here and read a pretty crystal clear example of combat, which explains both the AP rank stuff as well as how the base attack and base defense values work. My personal conclusion with combat in this game is that it's relatively crunchy and relatively deadly. One other really notable thing about combat is how wounds and injuries work. Basically, there are no hit points. If you noticed, there are hit locations in this game, and there is a clever built-in hit location determination when making an attack roll. Each body part has its own injury and wound threshold, and when enough incoming damage reaches either of those thresholds, you are penalized. With an injury, you get a -3 pre-roll penalty for each, and for each body part that reaches wound level, you increase your total wound hardship, which will eventually lead to a death roll where you can possibly die immediately. Here's a handy flowchart for summarizing all of that. I actually find this system to be pretty elegant compared to just tracking hit points. but it totally depends on everyone's mood and tolerance for this kind of granularity. I just find that a little more realism in combat damage can be pretty refreshing. Here's a list of wound effects that you can pick up when sustaining wounds to various parts of your character's body. They all manifest as temporary damage to your core attributes. And here is the master list of offensive actions you can take in combat. Notice that each has a different action point or AP cost, and some are ranges since they can be done at different distances to a target. And here is a much shorter master list of defensive actions. Vehicles in this system have their own set of 4 attributes: size, speed, frame, and handling, and a set of secondary attributes. Each vehicle can also have abilities of their own, and all of this stuff is essentially to handle vehicle combat, which has its own set of rules that I'm not going to get into here. I think the most important thing to note is that this system addresses vehicles at this level of detail. This is a really distinct kind of approach to vehicles in RPGs that's been around since almost the beginning of RPGs, where you're meant to track very specific probabilities of damage and damage effects. You don't get a dedicated full example of vehicle combat in the book, but you do get a lot of vehicle weapon options. Magic in this system is the catch-all term for both spells and superpowers, and those two sets of abilities largely work the same. Although this game doesn't have a native fantasy setting, it does present traditional magic as falling under 8 schools, and each school has a governing skill associated with it. To cast a spell, you roll that governing skill, and you have to have at least 1 rank in that skill. And defense against magic comes from a special derived attribute called magic defense. It's also worth noting that with both traditional magic and superpowers, you can accidentally surge, which happens if your dice explode a number of times above a certain threshold. Using the table here, you can figure out how severe the surge is, and then roll on one of the 5 surge effects tables. This whole concept is interesting because it's not a matter of if you will ever surge, but when. Roll enough d10s and you're going to land on a 10 multiple times in one round. That means they explode in this context. So essentially, the use of traditional magic and superpowers in this game is inherently dangerous to the user. Here are a couple of tables that describe surge effects for superpowers. As far as the spells and superpowers list goes, they are lumped together and called manifestations, and there are a total of 64 in this core rulebook. I thought it was pretty interesting that you can throw all spells and superpowers into one bucket, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. In other words, fantasy magic and comic book superpowers are kind of interchangeable for the most part, and I just need some time to process that fact. The last notable section, I think, is the adversaries at the end. This is a very generically presented set of potential enemies, and I guess this is probably the best way to do it. If you try to stat out all the possibilities for all genres of RPGs, it would be 1,000 pages of stat blocks. Instead, you get about 21 representational monster builds for the fantasy genre, including monster here, which gave me a chuckle, and then about 16 for the sci-fi genre. If you're not comfortable with doing some of your own game design and homebrewing, then this chapter will really leave you hanging. All right, here are my thoughts on the Heroes and Hardships Universal RPG System core rulebook. Very involved combat. This is a take it or leave it proposition. You're either into a higher level of crunch in your RPGs or you're not. The obvious con to higher crunch is that everybody at the table really needs to know the rules, or at least have the mental capacity and concentration to learn them at the table. The main pro to higher crunch is that you just get a more realistic, dare I say it, simulationist experience with combat. Crunch is not good or bad, it's just a personal preference thing. Homebrewing required. I've been reading the latest version of BRP and trying to get into Cortex Prime and all these other generic RPG systems, and the one thing they all have in common is that they require you, and by you I mean the game master, to homebrew a lot of the content. This is not a bug, it's a feature. People know this requirement going into it. But just in case you aren't aware of the fact, when you pick up a book like Heroes and Hardships, you're not picking up a game that is ready to be played on the spot. For example, if I wanted to run a fantasy campaign, or really even a one-shot with Heroes and Hardships, I would need a few days to come up with a definitive list of skills, abilities, and ancestry traits that are available to players, as well as a bevy of monsters and enemies not specifically statted in the core rulebook. Fun roll and keep dice system. The dice mechanic of rolling a pool of d10s and keeping a certain number based on the core attribute being rolled on is pretty fun. This may sound shallow, but I really appreciate probability matrices that aren't based on the d20 these days. D20 games are fine, but it's a real breath of fresh air to see a complex D10 dice pool system. Power levels. I was surprised at just how thoroughly the game incorporates the 3 optional power levels of play throughout all the mechanics and character options. This is an important lever to be able to crank up and down when it comes to a universal RPG system, if you think about it. In order to embrace all genres, you have to be able to ratchet up and down the PC's ability to affect the fictional world around them, and the power levels do that. Expanding ecosystem. It's comforting to know that if you wanted to get into Heroes and Hardships, there are already a couple dozen supplements to lean on, spanning the sci-fi, fantasy, and modern horror mystery genres. So maybe you don't have to homebrew all that much. That's all I've got for now. I'd be very curious to hear your experience with Heroes and Hardships at your table down in the comments. I've left a link to the online shop where you can order the physical core rulebook as well as all the supplements. Thanks as always for watching. See ya.